let's take a step back for a moment and actually consider the viability of SOCOM coming back as a potential piece of competition for the shooter space, because I kind of sat down and thought about it for a second and then thought to myself, I feel like there's no way that this could possibly work, because during the time in which SOCOM was an active franchise, which was between, as it says here on this Wikipedia page, from 2002 to 2012, a lot has changed in the past 13 years of gaming. A lot of shooters have gone to a more free-to-play model. You know, we look at the likes of Fortnite, we look at the likes of Apex Legends, and then we look at stuff like Call of Duty. Well, Call of Duty is kind of a bit of a mixed bag, I think, in that extent. When I say free to play, it's like whatever is kind of available in the case of Warzone. But mainline Call of Duty games still very much remain paid titles. So there's the first argument of, if, say, tomorrow PlayStation were to announce a new SOCOM, would more people be likely to play it if it was a paid title or if it was a free title? Because the thing is that free has negative connotations to it, but at this point, that same negative connotation will persist throughout all shooters. The fact that there's most likely going to be microtransactions, the fact that games are way more expensive to make, but then the problem of those games being way more expensive to make has fallen into the management style of many companies and how they are using their resources in order to actually develop those games, because a lot of games can be made for cheaper, but the problem is that those leaders in their positions are not doing enough to be able to save that money to then be able to create a space for studios to actually be able to save that money and make games at a cheaper cost. And SOCOM doesn't necessarily need to be a particularly high quality title for it to sell. It just needs to be a relatively cheap title if it does happen to cost money. Of course, everyone will still kind of worry, hey, is this game going to actually be any good? But the thing is that it's also worth considering that, like I said, when I was talking about the Fortnite, the Apex, and the Call of Duties, those people that play those games, they'll actually remain in those ecosystems as much as they humanly can, because when you are in a game, you will continue to play that game. And even when I look at, say, something like, I was thinking about Rainbow Six Siege. That was another game that came up in my mind, which was, you can't get people to move from a game to play another game, because now people are so heavily entrenched in some of these titles that have been around for quite some time. Keeping in mind that Rainbow Six Siege originally came out in 2015. Fortnite, while it originally came out in 2017, we didn't get the Battle Royale mode until 2018. So consider that Fortnite, came out 8 years ago, but only 7 years ago did it get A, incredibly popular, and then B, continue to build itself up by being able to partner with major franchises and household names, and not just on the Western side, but also with animation studios and being able to adapt anime characters into Fortnite. For example, stuff like the My Hero Academia characters, Goku, Dragon Ball characters, like all of that stuff. It kind of really goes a lot of different ways. But the problem then kind of becomes with something like we saw with Apex, where they tried to halve the actual amount of time per battle pass that you get, and you have to pay twice as much for the battle passes, because they split an entire battle pass into 2 half battle passes, but a single half battle pass costs the same as a full battle pass. And then they tried to pull that wretched stunt like they did with what was it called? The Buster Sword, the Final Fantasy VII collaboration event. And of course, even Call of Duty's Warzone gets into the whole wackiness with things like horror characters, Nicki Minaj, and just other people and characters to that extent. I think I remember the Xenomorph being in there somewhere. Correct me if I'm wrong, I'm pretty sure the Xenomorph might have been in there at some point in the not too distant past. But then I realized, okay, Apex Legends, Call of Duty, these are first-person titles. Fortnite is third-person, similar to SOCOM, but the thing is that SOCOM is not going to be anything like what Fortnite is. So I kind of, thought, okay, let's actually look down at the games that we've got. How did they do Metacritic-wise? And to be honest, they've been fairly strong titles, for the most part, being SOCOM US Navy SEALs, scoring an 82, SOCOM 2 and SOCOM 3 both scoring 87, 82 respectively on the PS2. Then we get Fireteam Bravo, 82 on PSP, Combined Assault, 72 on PS2, which was the lowest scoring title at the time. Fireteam Bravo 2, which was a sequel to the PSP game, also on PSP, scoring an 81. Tactical Strike and Fireteam Bravo 3, also both being PSP titles, 72, 74, but then we get Confrontation and SOCOM 4. SOCOM 4 being the first actual sequel to SOCOM 3, which feels like a really long time away, coming out at 63 and 67 respectively on the Metacritics, and luckily it's all here. And the thing is that I don't need to compare with other platforms, because keeping in mind that SOCOM was in fact a PlayStation exclusive. Now that then brought forward another interesting aspect to the whole thing. What about the other shooters in PlayStation's wheelhouse? So this is where I'm going to be talking about the Killzone and Resistance franchises. Now this is an interesting one, because Killzone was supposed to be the Halo killer. Unfortunately, it did not do well enough to last. Don't get me wrong, Killzone 1, Killzone 2 were good games. Killzone 3 was fine, and then Killzone Shadowfall was a god-awful title. Its story was incredibly not good, like it was very bad. I didn't like it at all, and the online multiplayer it really didn't feel like it would last that long. So I feel like Killzone 2 probably was the best Killzone in the series. Sure, you could make a argument for Killzone Liberation, which was the PSP game, but let's not get a little bit too ahead of ourselves here. That being said, Killzone was supposed to be the Halo killer. Halo outlasted Killzone, but look at where Halo is now. It's not selling particularly well. It's not doing particularly well as far as the critical reception goes. Sure, the campaign was well received, but the online, the lack of co-op multiplayer, co-op campaign, just completely missing out on key features that made Halo in the end. And so I feel like Killzone could come back and actually match up with Halo, to be completely honest. But again, same argument applies as we were talking about with Fortnite, Apex, Call of Duty, and Rainbow Six Siege. People play their shooters, but when they stick to a shooter, they are going to stick to a shooter. And so talking about Killzone, which leans more towards the multiplayer than it does the single player, I don't know again if this could make that big of an impact. And the thing is that SOCOM is a lesser than product compared to a Killzone or compared to a Resistance. Pretty much the idea of bringing back SOCOM as the shooter franchise that PlayStation should focus on kind of becomes more and more bleak the more I kind of look at what potential options there are for PlayStation to potentially go back to, while then considering just how many games are already out there and who are those people that are sitting on those franchises that they're wanting to kind of play and continue to play, that they likely won't move away from because the kings of live services are kind of there. And plus, when we think of a SOCOM, when we think of a Killzone, we don't think of live service. Even less so when we consider the Resistance franchise, which Resistance, incredibly fun game. It had a lot of incredibly creative weaponry that made it stand head and shoulders above other shooters, in my personal opinion. You can only carry at most 2 guns at a time. You could carry every weapon at once, yes. So it's more... Sorry, correction. Resistance is more of a boomer shooter in that sense. You can carry every single weapon on you. When you take damage, you have to pick up medkits. It's what Doom ended up bringing back with Doom 2016, I feel like Resistance should have kept going, because keeping in mind that we only had 4 Resistance games: Fall of Man, Resistance 2, Resistance 3, actually, you know what, 5, because I forgot about Resistance. Resistance Retribution was on PSP, but the one I forgot about was Resistance Burning Skies, which was on the Vita. That was actually the last Resistance game that we got. And don't get me wrong, stuff like using the auger by being able to shoot through walls and be able to create shields, and then the bullets go through walls a bit slower, being able to use stuff like the bullseye so you can tag an opponent and then shoot in any direction and your bullets would go in that direction. But the problem with Resistance as a franchise of coming back is that A, it's largely a single player franchise, because its campaign and stories do significantly better than the online. Granted, the online is fun, don't get me wrong, and the unique array of weapons do actually, you know, benefit the game quite substantially. But the problem with Resistance is that when people play it, they play it mostly to play through the campaign, because again, the story is actually fairly well written, all things considered, and that the weapons are best suited to the locations that are created. But if Doom 2016 can bring back Doom from the brink and actually be an incredibly successful franchise that anyone can look at and be like, this is a great thing, I feel like Resistance could do exactly the same thing. So I feel like out of the games that, you know, PlayStation has under their umbrella, SOCOM feels less likely a product to come back, and I feel like Resistance could be a far more competitively viable product. But the problem again then becomes people being so entrenched in their own specific niche of shooter that I feel like it would be difficult to again have enough people play Resistance for that game to then get further sequels and be further developed further down the line. Again, it just becomes very, very difficult to kind of put things together and be like, okay, what are we looking at? So as much as it would be cool for SOCOM to come back, which is kind of what the original premise was supposed to be, but I feel like no matter what PlayStation does to try and bring more people who like to play shooters play more on PlayStation, I feel like people are kind of, I guess, lost or gone in that sense, and bringing back older franchises just isn't going to benefit in any real way. And I feel like all these franchises have been gone for so long to the point where they kind of might as well be considered dead at this point. Who knows? But I mean, that's just kind of my thoughts about like, what is PlayStation going to do to bring back shooters into the limelight and actually bring people to play over on the PlayStation side. But then again, I feel like PlayStation doesn't really need to do anything in the end, because like it seems clear that Microsoft are shooting themselves in their own foot, so it kind of doesn't really make too much difference in that sense. But yeah, I guess that's just kind of my rambling thoughts about like whether or not SOCOM seems like a viable game to come back in any way. Like, is it actually viable for SOCOM to come back? And if I'm being completely honest, no, it isn't. If they brought back Killzone, would that make it viable? Not really, but I can see a small audience for it. But for Resistance, I see a smaller audience, but it being more successful just because it usually has a far stronger single player campaign than any of the games that I've mentioned thus far, and its multiplayer is largely carried by LAN parties. So as long as you're able to play local multiplayer with up to 4 people on a single console, I feel like you're good then. You don't really need the online. The online should only just serve as like a bonus to the game itself, but that feels like the most viable way for people to play shooters on PlayStation if PlayStation were ever to consider going back down that path and actually making those exclusives that we once knew and loved. That being said, however, let me know what you guys think about all of this in the comments below. Like the video if you liked it, subscribe to the channel. I'm aiming for 500 subs by the end of the year, and with all that being said, I do upload every day, so I'll see you guys tomorrow.